Wim, let me start with a question meant to ask you last time, but I can ask now. Pina Bausch was the choreographer, director, creator of a dance theater. And I'm wondering, what is theater in her work? And I'm wondering, is there a storytelling aspect to the work, and how you as a storyteller relate to that?
I wouldn't say there's a plot in her plays, but there is a lot of story elements. And I always thought secretly, but I never asked Pina, I thought she liked Beckett a lot. And that shows, I think, here and there. It's not a storyline, but it's situations, and if you follow the entire piece, and of course now you only saw little excerpts, you feel there is sort of a play there, but it's multifaceted and it has little vignettes, and some things come back and repeat, and there's different strings of stories. That it is narrative, yeah, remotely.
One talks, of course, about all the great possibilities and things that you can do working in 3D, but I'm wondering, for you as a filmmaker, were there any limitations? Was there anything you discovered that you couldn't do?
Well, there's quite an amount of stuff that you shouldn't do. You can do anything. But there's lots of stuff that you shouldn't do. We found out that any little mistake that you can make on regular film or on video, as far as that's concerned, and that mostly our eyes get used to very well. I mean, we have movies in our genes, and for 100 years we've been used to the fact that whenever there's a lateral pan, there's a light stroboscoping. You see that in any movie that you see all the time, there's a pan, and any vertical lines will stroboscope. And in 3D, it's not just twice as bad, it's quadrupled. It's really very bad. So lots of little mistakes get multiplied in 3D, so you learn that there's certain things you shouldn't do. Like panning, for instance, laterally. It's a no-no unless you're following somebody very closely, so that all the concentration is on that person and you don't pay attention to the background. There's a certain number of things that you shouldn't do. You shouldn't cut in certain ways that you see something very close to you, and the next cut, your eyes has to go very far. That is sort of painful, and we try to avoid that. You shouldn't cut all that much, as we're all used to by now in movies, but then you go see movies that come out today in 3D and they cut just as fast. And very often, to tell you the truth, it's to divert the audience from mistakes. Yeah, that's the case. I know that from experience.
Can you talk about how you went about selecting the pieces that do appear in the film? Was that ever something you discussed with Pina, or did it come about during the course of the filming?
The very first thing that Pina wanted to get done, as soon as we knew we were actually now going to make the movie, which took a long time, took more than 20 years, but that's a long story. But once we decided to do it in 3D, which was the solution to that 20-year story, and we sat down, the first thing that Pina really wanted to solve and wanted to clarify is which pieces can we shoot. And the pieces that were going to be in the film had to be on the schedule, on the agenda of the theater, because they had to be rehearsed, they had to be public performances, so we had the stage and the sets and everything. So, and in one season, 4 was the absolute maximum the company could handle. And for us too, for the length of our shooting schedule, 4 was about as much as we can handle. It would be 2 in one season and 2 the next season. So 4 was, in a course of maybe half a year, as much as the company and us could handle. So we had to limit the wealth of the 40 pieces that Pina had created to 4. And of course we thought of it, Pina and I, together as only the beginning. So we're going to start with 4. And 4 was the 4 pieces were going to be the backbone of the film we were going to do together. And there was quite an easy process in the beginning. The first 2 were set right away. It was the double bill of Café Müller and Sacre de Printemps, and Pina said that and I agreed, and we never had a discussion about it. That was set, so to speak. Those were the 2, if I might say so, big classics of the company from the 70s. And they perform them also as a double bill. It's one evening, and they start with Café Müller, and afterwards they roll out the Pete, and they do Sacre de Printemps. So that was one night. And then we had, and as these are 2 pieces from the 70s, we then thought, now let's pick something from more recently. And we both thought about it, and we both came to the conclusion that a recent piece that was very popular and one of Pina's biggest successes would be Full Moon, and we liked it both just as much, so that was set. And then it got a little bit more complicated, because out of a sudden we had 3 and there was only 1 left, and that now was painful. And we hesitated for weeks between, and I resaw a lot on tape, and we were very torn between Carnations and Aqua and Window Washer, and in the end decided for Kontakthof, because it is in Pina's work, and also I think in the history of dance, a very unique piece insofar as Pina did it at first with her own company in the late 70s, and then around 2000 she did the same choreographer with a cast of senior citizens between 65 and 80. Same choreography, same piece, and that was still playing. And in 2007, 6 or 7, she'd also done it one more time with teenagers, dance illiterate teenagers between 14 and 18. So there was one piece done by 3 different generations. Her ensemble, they're 30, 40, 50 years old, kids, teenagers, and seniors. And I really was very tempted by the idea to be able to cut through these generations and sort of film all 3, as the teenagers and the seniors were still playing, and they were going to phase out both performances soon. And Pina was a little hesitant because she didn't quite know what I meant with cutting through the generations and from one to the other, but I told her it's going to really work, Pina. We just have to shoot the 3 generations. And then finally her ensemble so much wanted to do Kontakthof again because they hadn't done it for a long time, and they were sort of a little bit jealous that the senior citizens were traveling all over the world and the teenagers were traveling all over the world, and they hadn't done it for the longest time. So then everybody wanted to do Kontakthof, and that gave us 4, and that was unfortunately the end of it. And I'm still sometimes waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, well, if you could have done Carnation, it would have been wonderful, but we had to limit ourselves to 4.
Once you chose the pieces, how did you choose the dancers?
I didn't choose any dancers. I mean, the cast was, of course, Pina's, and
But the cast had changed over the years for those pieces.
yes,
hasn't it?
and Pina had actually herself rehearsed the replacements. It wasn't so many. It was in each of the pieces. Café Müller was a cast that was set for a long time, and Pina had rehearsed her own replacement because she was afraid she might not be able to dance it anymore, but then again, she wanted to dance it one more time for the film, and she had been dancing. That is, Pina danced in 2 pieces, in Café Müller and in Danson, And she had rehearsed Hélène, a French dancer, to do her part, and everybody else was doing Camilla for years already. She had rehearsed a number of young dancers for Sacre, and also in Vollmond and Kontakthof there were a number of people who did it for the first time, but those are all big casts of more than 20, so most of them had done it for a long time already. So cast was completely done by Pina, and she had rehearsed herself all the new dancers in it.
While you're working on the film, when could you actually see it in 3D? Did you shoot it and then get to see it, or were you along the way actually seeing what the 3D results were?
We saw live 3D. We had a live monitor, and actually even in another room, a live screen, but that was in a different room. And in order to be there with the cameras and see the performances, I had to do it in front of a monitor, a 3D monitor. So, but mainly, I just was not looking at the monitor. I was looking at the live performances and giving directions to my cameras. And looking at the monitor, you always had to put on the glasses, and then you had to take them off again. So you had to constantly sit there, and that was very tiring. So I ended up leaving the monitor to my 3D supervisor, who was looking at it for technical things, and I basically just saw it live and could see it in the evening then in 3D, or later in the night.
Let's get some questions from all of you. Yes, right here.
Can you share the significance of the locations you chose, the exteriors, and also not to crush 3D, but would it be available in 2D?
Let me just repeat the question. The first is if you could talk about the choice of locations, and the second is about the question of 2D. And it has been presented in 2D in some places.
Yes, we did present a print. We did work for quite a long time on getting a good print, a film print, and that by definition was only 2D, mainly for cities and places where they didn't have any chance to see it in 3D. Actually, one of the very first screenings I had, I showed the film once we had the first DCP, the digital format, and I showed it to a number of friends. And one of my friends afterwards came to me and said, I really don't get it, why this had to be in 3D, Wim. This is so beautiful. Because he was a one-eyed Jack. He had an arrow shot in one eye when he was a little boy, so he could only see it with one eye anyway. And for him, there was no necessity for it to be in 3D. And so, but at least I knew that it was decent looking in 2D as well. And we went at great lengths to produce a good 2D copy, but then again, it wasn't used so much in Europe, where the film has been playing since the spring. Maybe 10-15% of the audience saw it in 2D. And in most cities where 3D was available, the 2D prints didn't find an audience.
Mm-hmm. And the question about locations?
Oh, yeah. Because of Pina's sudden passing away before we started the film, before we ever were able to actually shoot one thing, I cancelled the film. That was 2 months before we actually were going to start shooting. That was, Pina died in late June of 2009. We're going to start in late September. And I pulled the plug and canceled the film because there seemed to be no purpose. We had planned it together for so long, and it seemed just tragic that she never lived to see it or be part of it. So I canceled it and gave up on it. Unlike the dancers who didn't give up, they actually even performed the night that Pina died, in tears, but they performed. They were on tour in Poland when they heard of Pina's death. And very soon afterwards, they decided as a company to continue. And because I had decided as a company to continue for at least the next 3 years, a few weeks later, in September, they started, a couple of months later, they started to rehearse the 4 pieces that Pina had selected. And they made me understand that this could very well be the last time they were performing it, because nobody knew if actually they could continue for long enough. And they made me understand that Pina's eyes were still on these pieces. She had rehearsed the young dancers. And they made me understand that Pina really had been looking forward to filming these pieces for so long, and had been looking forward for the 2 of us to finally do it in this new language and in a different way than dance had been filmed before, that they felt it was a crying shame that I had walked away from it, and sort of asked me to reconsider that decision. And as I was talking with the dancers, I realized that, well, definitely we couldn't make the film with Pina anymore, but I realized maybe there was a different film that we could for Pina, and it was almost more important for the living to make this movie than for the memory of Pina. It seemed like this ensemble, these 36 dancers, none of them had been able to say goodbye to Pina, or thank you, and it seemed that they really needed a way to come to terms with it, and a film that we could do together on a very different basis might be a way to do this. So we jump-started the film, and we did the 4 pieces first, and then we took a long break, almost 6 months, and I went into the editing room and edited the pieces in order to find out how you edit in 3D, but mainly in order to find out how we can make a movie together, the dancers and I, because the pieces in themselves were definitely not going to constitute a movie. And this is where your question kicks in about the locations. I mean, it took a while. It was a long process. It took about half a year until we realized that we could only make a film if we somehow were able to immerse ourselves into Pina's own process. And Pina had developed her pieces, all the new pieces for the last 20, 25 years, by a very unique method of questioning her dancers, questions and answers. She had a vague idea what the new piece was going to be about, and around this subject she created a catalog of questions, elaborate questions, and very intimate questions and general questions, all sorts of questions around that piece that she dreamt of, and she asked her dancers these questions, each and every one of them. And they were only allowed to answer with gestures and with their bodies and movement and dance. And Pina would look at each dancer and his or her answer and would be very critical and say, well, this is a lame answer, or this is quite a cliche that you've showed me. Can't you be more personal? And can you be more precise? And she would really go very far. She wanted to know more. She wanted to find answers that were from the heart and specific, and she really forced her dancers to go out all the way, and they would work together on these answers, sometimes for weeks. And at the end of this long process, Pina would have material, 100 hours sometimes or more, of material around the subject of her piece, and that would then be distilled into 2 or 3 hours. And we realized that if we were going to make a movie together for Pina, we had to somehow assimilate this process. So I started to develop my own catalog of questions to the dancers. And I asked them questions about Pina and about their relationship, and a lot of them I asked, for instance, what Pina had seen in them that they had not known before they had that in them. And they showed me. And the rule of our game was, because I'm not a choreographer, the rule of our own game was answer please with something that Pina had her eyes on, and that you, from the whole catalog, sometimes of 20 years of working, something that Pina saw, and that you developed together with Pina. Give me an answer where you were closest to her, or when she saw you and you were surprised that you were that person that you saw. Can you show that to me? And they all gave me lots of answers, and then I had also a huge catalog of answers like Pina, and also had to trim and select, and in the end only have one or two from answers from every dancer, and so that the overall image of all of the answers was Pina's universe, so to speak, and wasn't overlapping so much. And then, because we had done this whole process only in the rehearsal room, it was obvious we wouldn't shoot it there, because the rehearsal room was quite an ugly room with not much light, and it was an old movie theater where Pina had worked on for 30 years. And it was not attractive. And we wouldn't have wanted shot these answers there. And that's when I realized I needed places, because we didn't even have a stage. There was no sets for these answers. And that's when I realized the outside world was the only solution. And I started to look around in Wuppertal and the neighborhood, and then was sort of my ambition was to find one place for each answer, and to find the right place for each answer that would bring out the best in each answer, and that would make the answer shine. And luckily I knew the city quite well, because I'd already made a movie there a long time ago, Alice in the Cities. And I knew the area because I'd gone to school there, and I was born and raised not so far away from there. So we found these places in relation to these answers, and in the end found one place for each and every one. And so the places had a function in relation to what the dancers wanted to show us, and also had a function in relation to this little city that I liked so much, and that Pina, after all, had worked in for almost 40 years, and that single-handedly had supported her theater. It's not a rich town, it's a working-class town that once had its glorious days in the 19th century when it was quite rich, and you still see that. The city was once very rich. That hanging train was an extravagancy that it could afford, because it was built turn of the century, 1900, same year as the Eiffel Tower. In a strange way, it's like the Eiffel Tower, only horizontally. And they invented aspirin in Wuppertal. So it had enormous chemical industry and textile industry, and was a rich city. And so, but in the 20th century, it had gone the way of many cities that once had a lot of industry in the 19th century, and is in quite a depression now. And the Tanztheater Wuppertal Pina Bausch is almost like its only extravagancy that the city maintained in the arts since its beginning, since the early 70s. So I wanted the city to appear in the film, and I really wanted it to play an important part.
The questions. Yes, over here.
Most of the really famous dance directors in film have either been choreographers or dancers themselves, and I wondered how you think your film is different, because you're not a dancer as far as I know. And the other question
Could show you a few steps.
that I have is, as I'm seeing this movie, I was thinking a lot of one of the films by Louis Malle, where he really consciously tried to show how Andre, whatever his name was, how he directed, because he was interested in showing direction. And I'm just wondering, did you have any thought of that in making this movie?
Two questions. The first one is, in what ways do you feel that this film is different from other dance films that you know of or have seen? And the second really is, that in a film like, I guess it's Vanya on 42nd Street, Louis Malle really tries to show the process, the way in which Andre Gregory works, directs. And did you ever think of trying to get into that aspect of Pina's work?
Well, the film that Pina and I wanted to make together, and the concept for that film, was a film about Pina's eyes at work. And I really wanted to film these extraordinary eyes and their unbelievable capacity to decipher movement and to turn it into something that she would show us. And Pina's eyes were really unique, the way she saw and the way, the patience with which she saw and the obsession. And so that film would have been an extremely different film. The film we had in mind was very, very different. And none of what you saw, except for the 4 pieces, what you saw in this film, we would have shot. None of that. We would have accompanied Pina, we would have shown rehearsals, and we would have especially shown critiques the next day, which is a very interesting process because Pina saw each and every performance, and the next morning they would dedicate 4 or 5 hours to critique. And Pina was not so much a perfectionist in terms of movement or aesthetics. She was a perfectionist in terms of the intention, in terms of the truth of the performance, of the initial answers that she wanted to see again. And she didn't want to see something perfect, but she wanted to see something perfectly honest. And they would work on that every day, and we would have been able to film that. And also we would have traveled with the company to Brazil and to Korea, to Southeast Asia and to South America. And we would have really concentrated on Pina's working process. And that, of course, we couldn't do anymore. And in a strange way, then, with the dancers and through the dancers, the film still became a film on Pina's eyes, but in a very different way. And for the rest of your question, I was probably the most unlikely director for a dance film. And the fact that I worked with the dancers was involuntary. We didn't intend that. I mean, I was really wanting to stay behind Pina and film her and the dancers. And the fact that out of a sudden I had this direct relationship was very unusual and something I almost didn't feel ready to. But then again, what I asked the dancers to do was not to invent something for me, but to do what they've done with Pina and to recall Pina. So I felt able to do it. And I always had 2 dancers present to judge the dancing part of every performance. There was always Dominique, who is now the artistic director, the oldest dancer, and Pina's assistant Robert, and all the time another dancer, because for each and every one of Pina's pieces, she had assigned 1 or 2 dancers who were their assistants, and for each and every piece there was a dancer who was responsible. So I always had at least 2 dancers with me to judge the dancing part, which I could never do. But of course, as far as the camera work and as far as there was choreography involved, the reverse choreography of the camera, so to speak. And I was the most unlikely director to begin with, because before I was introduced to Pina's work, I had nothing to do with dance, really. Include me out. I was dance illiterate. And it was only through Pina and through the incredible things she showed me and what I saw blew me away so much, because I didn't think before that dance could concern me, and Pina's work concerned me like nothing else had ever concerned me and ever touched me. So, and I did know all of her pieces, and of course through Pina I also saw other companies, although nothing else ever touched me that much as Pina. Still, when we made this film, I was an unlikely director for a dance film. And it was a fantastic experience to work with these dancers, And I think the saving grace for our relation was that I didn't really have to tell him what to do. I just had to tell him how I was going to film it, because their schooling with Pina was such that they were so much used that they had to be as much as possible themselves. Pina was abolished any role playing, any character playing. Pina didn't want to see roles. She wanted to see these dancers themselves. She wanted to see their identity as much as possible. So my biggest task was to make sure that they weren't starting to play to the camera. And they didn't. They really, even in front of the camera, knew that what Pina would have expected from them, and Pina didn't want them to play to the audience, that she didn't want them to play to the camera. They were without roles, and even in front of the camera. And even in some of the close-ups, for instance, in The Rites of Spring, when the girls come forward to the camera and look into the lens, that was very demanding for any actor to act into the camera, and they did this without a blink of the eye and without really playing to the camera. So I had a perfect ensemble for this task. And I did learn a lot in the process of this film, I can tell you. I learned a lot from Pina to begin with. And as we're speaking about film directors, I didn't see Louis Malle's film that you mentioned. I saw lots of his work, but I didn't see that one, so I can't comment this. But I can say something on the relation on film directors and dance, because, and I'm speaking about myself, but also I take the liberty to speak about my colleagues, because I think I can. Because we do have actors in front of our camera all the time, and what is the famous presence of the actor if not his or her body language? That is what makes a great actor, that he has that affinity to the camera with his body. So because we correct them and we tell them what to do and we observe them and we say, no, don't do that, you're doing too much, a little less, we feel we are sort of specialists in the so-called body language. We assume we know stuff. All of us, we do think we are experts. And getting to know Pina and really working with Pina and watching her work for so long and studying her pieces, and some of them I know by heart by now, I realized that in my profession, starting with myself, most of us directors are completely illiterate in the language of the bodies in comparison to Pina. What we know is useless. And what we can tell actors is 1% of what Pina was able to tell her dancers. So it was a great lesson in modesty, I must say. And I wish a lot of directors could have gone to school with Pina Bausch. Thank you.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We have to set up for the next show. Wim, thank you so much for
Thank you, Richard.
coming to New York and being here. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you.